Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Sorry to have to turn down the nice, smooth jazz music that we had going on, but let's get started. My name is Elaine Ham, and I am the Executive Director for the Alliance for Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare, or the AAIH, because we love acronyms. We are really excited about today's webinar and our incredible guests, and I'm sure you all will have a lot of questions. So please pop them into the Q&A button at the bottom, and we will try to get to them at the end of today's webinar. Just as a reminder, today's webinar will be recorded, and we will add it to our website next week. We're going to start today's webinar with a fireside chat and then move to our panel. But before I introduce our moderator, I am going to share just a quick overview of the AAIH. So the AIH was founded by organizations that really wanted to help unite AI and healthcare developers to tackle a number of issues within our industry. Our mission was crafted to really help unite, unify, represent, and advocate for AI in healthcare. And our members are as diverse as our industry, working in AI and drug discovery, clinical trials, digital health, as well as healthcare delivery. We really focus on education, advocacy, standardization, and partnerships within our industry to help advance AI and healthcare. If you are interested in joining us, please go to our website, theaaih.org. Membership in our organization provides networking and business development opportunities, as well as options to participate in events like this and become thought leaders within our industry. Our goal is really to help build up the very industry we work in and foster collaboration and knowledge of AI in healthcare, with the ultimate goal of improving patient outcomes across the entire healthcare spectrum. And with that, I'm going to turn over this webinar to our illustrious host, Paul Howard. Paul, are you there? You are. All right, perfect. So I will turn it into the very capable hands of Paul.
Thank you very much, Elaine. I am Paul Howard. I'm a senior advisor to the AAIH, as well as senior director for public policy at Amicus Therapeutics, a rare disease-focused biotech company. We're going to start today with a fireside chat with Ram Iyer, who is the chief data officer at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, where Ram has the accountability to develop and execute an agency-wide data modernization strategy, building robust central functions that can be leveraged by the centers and the agency overall for high-value decision-making. The scope of his remit spans the entire tech stack, from data identification to actionable decision, including data policies and governance. Ram is an industry and peer-recognized data and technology professional with experience in the pharma, consulting, telecom, and international government organizations. His expertise includes data and decision sciences, digital and technology architecture, and talent development, with a focus on building collaborative partnerships and ecosystems. Before joining the agency, Ram was the head of enterprise architecture and executive director of analysis Center of Excellence at Bristol Myers Squibb. There, he helped jumpstart several data and analytic practices at BMS, including enterprise-class platforms for reproducible research, model management, and visual analytics. He also built a thriving network of data scientists, data analysts, and visual storytellers to help BMS tackle urgent and complex problems in the organization. Ram and I are going to talk till about 12:20, when I'm going to pivot to our panel, including Lena Nielsen, who is the vice president of product at Recursion, a biotech that is reimagining drug discovery using machine learning and large-scale laboratory automation. Previously, Lena was the COO of Entalytic, a biotech startup that develops deep learning solutions to improve clinical radiology. Before that, as innovation director at the University of California, Berkeley, Lena helped spin out social impact technologies and develop entrepreneurial programs for students. Ari Caroline, another panelist, is the CEO and co-founder at Weave Bio. Ari has extensive work experience in the healthcare and technology industries. Prior to his executive role at Weave, Ari worked at Tempus Labs from December 2019 to February 22 in the role of SVP for real-world data. Prior to that, Ari also co-founded DOT Technologies in August 2019 and served as CEO until December of that year. Ari's career began in 2003 at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, including serving as the chief analytics officer from 2014 to 2019, and Director of Strategic Initiatives and Quantitative Analysis from 2006 to 2013. Our next speaker on the panel is going to be Jason Rayburn. Jason is a partner in the London office of Paul Hastings and heads up their London intellectual property and technology litigation practice. Jason's practice has a particular focus on complex technology disputes, often relating to trade secrets, patents, and copyright in the fields of software development and licensing, cloud, and AI-related implementations. His practice also encompasses IP crossover issues involving breach of contract, IT infrastructure, the misuse of data, and reputational threats. Jason also sits part-time as a judge in the English High Court, as a deputy master of the Chancery Division, and formerly as a judge of the First Tier Tribunal hearing specialist appeals. Last but very far from least, Anand Ramasubramaniam is the regulatory science and portfolio delivery product line lead at Roche Genentech. Anand is a seasoned information sciences professional with over 25 years of experience across diverse industries, including biopharmaceuticals, food, finance, and insurance, with a strong background in process, re-engineering, and project management. Anand has developed an enterprise scalable data management process, development, and established industry-leading project management practices. Prior to Genentech Roche, Anand also held leadership roles at Amgen, including product development, informatics, and directing information systems. With that, let me turn to my fireside chat with Ram. Ram, thank you very much for joining today. I should note that I'm also a former FDAer myself. I served as one of then Commissioner Scott Gottlieb's senior advisors from 2017 to 2019. Thank you so much for your time. I know how extraordinarily busy you are. To get us started, when I was at the agency, I mentioned this to you the other day, I sat in a room with Amy Abernethy and watched her whiteboard how to break down the information silos at the agency and modernize the systems there to really take advantage of new sciences like artificial intelligence and machine learning, or I should say evolving sciences. They are sciences that are actually 50 years old. But could you talk about how you are leading and setting the stage for innovative AI and ML applications through the Office of Digital Technology Transformation, including the ODT's Information Technology Strategy, which spans the next 3 years?
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Paul, and thank you to AIH for inviting me to talk about some of the areas we are working on. A few things that have happened since, Paul, you left FTA. The current IT organization led by the CIO is actually now transformed into what is called Office of Digital Transformation. And it's probably one of the few agencies within the HHS that reports directly to the commissioner. Previously, it was part of an operating. So that shows the strategic value and the importance that we are providing. And along with that, we rolled out a series of, we call them MAPs, the Data Modernization Action Plan, Technology Modernization Action Plan, Security, as well as Leadership. All of those are coming together to provide innovative solutions, not only in the AI ML space, but also across a lot of other areas, such as workflow, such as productivity improvements, etc. So with that, we also launched recently, just a few months back, an IT strategy. And there are several pillars in that. And the two that are really relevant to this group are the data sharing. FDA is not, each of the centers in FDA, they are not dependent or independent. They are highly interdependent. So the data sharing has become a critical component for us, not only for the basic back blocking and tackling of what we need to do, but also to leverage and use the new technologies such as AI, especially the generative AI models. So that's one thing that's become a high priority, and we made some great strides in that area. The second area is talent development. And we are taking a very innovative approach on the talent development. We know we cannot mint all the graduates and PhDs overnight. So we are looking at a tremendous wealth of talent that's already within the agency. And we are upskilling, creating a rising tide effect for them to use all the platforms that we have, as well as what the industry is truly innovating in many of the areas. So those two are going to be an important part of our strategy going forward. And we are accelerating these at a rapid pace as we speak. And a lot of folks are already trained on so many of those right now.
That's really helpful. Like any organization, we're all on this journey together. Historically, there's a lot of legacy built into our IT stacks. The division of centers, of course, makes complete sense because of the products that the agency is reviewing. But when we look at fundamental disease biology, we're looking at the same problem, the same challenge. So maybe could you talk about how these tools can help CDRH, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and CBER and CBER all kind of harness decades of data, both structured and unstructured, to make more informed regulatory decisions? But feel free to pull in examples from across the agency.
Yeah, I think in the AI/ML space, they talk about the transfer, right? The transfer of models, transfer of, something that helps you find the edges in a furniture can also help you to find edges in a radiological image, right? So all of that is truly applicable even in the work that we do. So to help with that, rather than creating these individual expertise, we have just formed an AI board, which I'm not calling it a governance board. I'm calling it a governance and guidance board, because we want this to move from an organization that says no to innovation to K-N-O-W, a different kind of no, the knowledge that is required for us to be successful. So what we are doing is we are taking pilots in the continuum of complexity and risk, and making them visible so that we can learn from them and transfer that knowledge so that we are jumpstarting the next initiative. So we are starting those in simple areas like basic productivity improvements, right? That is going to now become part of many of the platforms that we already own and will be migrating, right? So that will do the day-to-day AI for us. That is completely invisible to the lay users, all the way to what do we do when a device has an algorithm and that shift could happen, a drift could happen? What policy do we need to have? We're looking at that entire spectrum. And the way we're doing this is we are being very clear, where does the scope and the remit for each of that continuum lies? Sometimes it lies with a very specific office within one of our centers, in the case of CDRH, that policy has to be driven from there. But they don't live in isolation. So we want to pick some of those key elements and apply that to how does it apply in CBER, especially when there is a product that has a device component and a biologics component. That is happening more and more. So we are trying to bring this board to advise us on how to proceed with all of those. And some of the pilots that we are doing are much more in the traditional space. We are now slowly migrating that into to using the LLM. We are using it now. We are very successful, very long-running pilots, almost 2.5 years, on our imports. Because that is a big area of risk for us with what you hear about fentanyl, what you're hearing about the risks in the seafood, the COVID pandemic, the supply chain risks, etc. That is an area that we want to really focus, and we've made some great strides in that. We also are talking to our regulatory operations on some of the standard inspections that we do and the letters that we issue. Sometimes they take up to 2 weeks. So how can we reduce the cycle to a few days or a few hours? That'll provide some great responsiveness to the industry as well as productivity for our folks. And the third one is things that are the complexity of the multimedia of advertisements and marketing campaigns that go. How do we make sure that those marketing are in compliance with the approvals that was already provided by the agency? So we are applying some really interesting, innovative technologies there as well. Those are just some examples that I can talk to, but there are several that are happening behind the scene that will help us to move, improve the approval process, the inspections related to that, as well as any operational post-market surveillance that we need to do. So we're looking at use cases across that entire spectrum.
What role or where have you seen, or what are you excited about when we're specifically looking at the NLP space, the natural language processing, and the LLM space? FDA reviewers across all divisions are dealing with just amazingly complex and sometimes fast-moving data, as you said, at the ports, sometimes making a decision about potential product risk or a class of products risk. How do you see those tools helping reviewers make more informed decisions, but then again, building, as you said, that knowledge base so you can apply it to multiple challenges?
Yeah, think we are doing that in multiple steps. Going back to the data sharing I talked about, the data sharing has to be more robust so that the data that we are applying to these models does not have some of the risks that we all talk about in these models. How do we avoid the past biases going into that, right? So that's one area we are looking into. I must say that we are just scratching the surface of that, right? We have some ways to go there. And the other piece is there are certain things that actually come to us with a lot of great structure in it. I think those are easy ones that we can apply some technologies right away to analyze as well as make some recommendation.
Like new drug applications or biological license,
Exactly.
things that are very highly structured.
Highly structured, I think. But there is also a process component to that, right? Not only do we want to analyze them faster, but also be able to have multiple partners and multiple stakeholders look at that in a more near real-time basis. So we are looking into the workflow and the platforms that we are all collaborating into that. So that's an area we ought to look at. It's not just about the models being ready. It's also being able to consume and have the collaboration that's required. So we are looking into that as well.
I think your
Sorry,
I'm sorry, no, go ahead, finish your thought.
Yeah, and then the area that we are being very careful is automating the review itself, right? Giving insights and then making the reviewers get 60% of the way, 70%. That area, that's an area we'll be very careful, and the centers will take a lot of leadership on that. And our job, from a central CDO perspective, is to make sure that the pipelines and standards are maintained across those.
And that obviously is trying to, like we're all trying to do, free up time for the reviewers to make more higher level cognitive decisions rather than having them spend time just making charts or just making graphs. But Ram, I think one question, I know we're just about out of time, but I wanted to ask on behalf of the community, how should the community look to you, look to the FDA to engage around some of these issues around standardization, around confidence, addressing issues like hallucination, but really developing the tool set that we all need to assess the safety and productivity and efficiency of these models?
Yeah, we put out policy document. We look for forums. We also have a platform now. We are going to start to promote more to allow for faster closed loop discussions. And we will do that through not just policy documents and public hearings. We also want to do that through real life projects. We want to take examples of things that we want to do, and we think that might benefit from these types of technology, and bring NGOs, universities, industry partners, and technology partners to make that happen. And the good news is we already have a platform to do that. So you will hear more about those, and love to get from you any use cases that you think are relevant. You can contact us directly or through some of the forums like this. Love to hear those productive use cases. And the last thing I would say is, if there are examples that you have that is a true positive deviant in this space, we want to hear from that, because then we want to learn from those as well.
And just to be clear, are you thinking of something like a shared learning space where multiple stakeholders can come together and say, what do we think good looks like for this particular application of AI/ML?
Yes, we can do that. And we also have a yearly summit, but we want to make it more frequent, and we might even have one specifically focused on AI. We're thinking maybe in the spring, summer timeframe, we will launch that. That's the early stages. We've not decided whether we want to do that. And then what we want to move away from is, we hear a lot of these papers on how things should be done, but we want to apply it to a real life problem, and then see how, like a demonstration project or a low risk use case, and see what we can learn from that. You
want to translate a high level recommendation into an actual engineering standard that people can use.
Exactly.
That's terrific. I think that's the absolute right approach. Very exciting. Thank you so much for your time today, Ram.
All right.
I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'd like to invite our panelists now to turn on their cameras and join the discussion while Ram goes back to his work at the agency. Of course, I'd like to thank him for really thoughtful remarks and sharing his time. I think there are a lot of places where we can we can kind of start to dig into this discussion. But maybe I'll just start with Lena at Recursion and Ari at Weave Bio to talk about how particularly we're using applications of large language models. I know that both of you have done work on that, and thinking about how you organize data to make more informed decisions, particularly both for your internal teams and as you're going to be interacting or helping customers interact with regulators. Lena, why don't I turn to you first?
Sure, I'll kick it off. I think Ari and Recursion, we do some very complementary pieces. So our tech stack spans from early R&D into clinical trials, but the focus today of our foundation models in chemistry and imaging and our large language models, that's really in the R&D pipeline up to IND. And so that's where we're having material impact today and where we're learning lessons for that post-IND pieces. So I'm going to give two examples, kind of our big two use cases of LLMs. One is, the key capability of Recursion is building these massive biological and chemical relationship networks based on gigantic high throughput experiments that we run essentially 24/7. And then the question becomes, how do we make sense of these hundreds and thousands, up to trillions of data points in an efficient and smart way? And here we use LLMs in very big ways at Recursion, essentially querying the global external knowledge base and then comparing and contrasting that with what we are seeing in-house in our experiments. Where do our findings line up with what is known and what is canonical? Where are we seeing something novel and potentially interesting, right? So essentially that's using LLMs at scale to prioritize and find powerful starting points. Obviously, you could do this manually at slow volumes, but once you get to these massive data set opportunities, that doesn't really scale, right? And this allows us then to have a more unbiased way to sort our internal data. And then second, and this one is really new, so I'm really excited to be able to talk about it, and it's very different. We're building out an LLM-based system to perform drug discovery tasks, essentially coordinating and deploying our existing in-house tools. Imagine kind of a instantaneous digital conductor of tools that we have. And I think that's really neat to think about maybe in the audience as a new way to think about LLMs, where it's not like ChatGPT where you're generating text. This is about coordinating your scientific work in an efficient way, and that's just a different kind of tool. So, and I should add too, before I hand it over to Ari to share about Weave, that we're going to be demoing this new tool at JP Morgan in January. So really excited to be sharing details with the community and hear what other people are doing.
Thank you. Thank you. Ari, why don't you take us through what Weave Bio is working on?
Sure. Yeah, as Lena said, they truly are sort of complementary pieces, but they actually also represent something of a transition in terms of how we use the LLMs. So, in the applications that Lena was describing, in some ways, discovery, a bit of hallucination is a good thing. You want to discover connections that weren't discovered before with all of this information. Obviously, you need it to be somewhat grounded in the science. But then as you get to the point where you say, this is the drug we want to move forward, or the decision process of saying this is the drug that we want to move forward, and you're ready to submit an IND or start preparing an IND, you have to become much more grounded in terms of what the information is that you're representing. You can't have, make up things or have new discovery processes that are happening at the stage when you're submitting something to FDA. So on the one hand, we have to be able to make those same connections from a science perspective, but we need also to ground based on what studies have been done so far, what's been derived from those studies, and how can we start to use that to help generating some of these submissions, generating your regulatory documents. And so that's where our flagship product, Auto IND, comes in, where it's, pretty much would be, in this future world, taking the outputs from the models that Lena was describing and starting to use them to draft submissions and then make the review process a lot easier as well. So that was something Ram touched on earlier. They have these reviewers who have these unreasonable expectations that are laid on them of reviewing these thousands and thousands of pages of documents. And if we can make their jobs easier, all the better.
And they're working under deadlines imposed by Congress as part of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act or alternative user fees. Anand, does what you've heard resonate with what you're working on at Roche Genentech? I think another really interesting potential of these tools is they could help us, not just the industry, but also regulators, continue to converge on regulatory harmonization issues, which are issues we've been working on for a very long time, but sometimes struggle about.
Yes, at Roche and Generative, we started off pretty early in this effort of utilizing and leveraging large language models in several aspects in pharma and diagnostics. Now, what we did was when we realized this, there is so much so much variations that are coming up in different industries and disciplines. So we consolidated all the efforts into created an enterprise strategy under a catchy name called Galileo, for ensuring that we kind of harmonize these efforts so that it also meets these regulatory standards or advise regulatory bodies about how we go about LLM models. Areas we are experimenting specifically is, in research and development, quite a few, as well as in commercial manufacturing as well. I will just give some examples here from a computational drug design. How do we predict drug interactions, hypothesis generation for target identifications, or some areas where from publication data and specifically. So these are some areas where we really started to move the needle a little bit more on that, and ability to generate concise summaries through multiple models, in fact, selection of models to say, hey, this is from scientific information from literature, from publications and stuff like that as well. One of the key areas where we are now focusing is how do we generate statistical analysis for NDA and BLA submissions. This is still in a pilot phase, extremely important for us, analyzing the data for clinical sciences, questions that need to be answered, either it's outside of the scope of NDA or BLA. How does the regulators actually accept that kind of information, pretty much leveraging ChatGPT at this point. These are the areas where we are experimenting and having pilots running across. Obviously, this does depend on how the regulators view and accept that kind of analysis there. Few other areas which are pretty common in the industry, and many of them are experimenting, is the ability to generate content, say almost document authoring content for, say, either a BLA or specific documents related to those things, such as a clinical trial protocol or drafting labels from data, sections of the clinical study report, if need to be generated. All of these areas where we are doing. Interestingly, there is other pilots as well. Importantly, say if there is a new regulations that come in, how does that impact certain products within Roche and Genentech, generating clinical summaries? These are areas where we are experimenting along with it and trying to say, how can we work with the regulators to influence acceptance of such content as well?
That's terrific. I think it's also a great opportunity to pull Jason into the conversation. Jason, do you foresee any potential legal issues arising from the use of LLMs in the regulated context specifically that we're talking about? And could you talk about what you see as the evolving regulatory frameworks for LLMs in healthcare more generally?
Sure. I think there's so many legal issues we could talk about, and I could be talking for days on some of the legal issues that arise. But I think but two that are quite interesting to talk about, which are both practical and legal in effect. One, standardization. Another one is transparency. So when I say standardization, obviously LLMs generally have the opportunity to create standards and data and standard data sets at a scale which wasn't previously available. But I think the sense of standardization that's been commented by some in academia and some in the legislative process is technical standardization. So similar to what we have in the IEEE, for example, and the ISO for technical standards for telecommunications, for example. If that were to ever be imposed, that's obviously would be quite radical, but it's something that's discussed for particular data sets, in that one of the inherent both benefits and one of the perceived downsides is there is no standardization in relation to data sets used for LLMs. I think if that were to be introduced in some way, shape, or form, which would probably be a difficult task for different countries, one of the interesting legal points that could lead to, drawing examples from history, is the Frand Wars we've seen, and some of those on this call might be aware of that. It's the real proliferation of patent litigation over any patents which are relevant to the particular applicable standard, and that's something you could see happening if there were to be technical standards in this area. That's something we may need to keep an eye on in particular. That standardization, I think, related to that is also transparency, and obviously that pervades the regulatory focus, which we'll get onto in a moment, and including some of the comments that Ram mentioned earlier about the KNOW, as opposed to the NO. I think the starting point there, obviously, for everyone involved, and particularly from an IP perspective, sometimes transparency, in particular explainability and performance assessment, which are the two real cores that our regulators focus on, those can sometimes be at odds with the IP world in terms of trade secrets and patentability. So real focus and sort of being aware of what information is being kind of included in the public sphere is obviously or being given to others is of paramount importance. But I think the real kind of practical point effectively is making sure that sponsors and really anyone who's involved in LLMs gets to know and understand what they can and can't do. And it's a really basic sentiment. But I guess you'd be surprised at the number of people that don't fully grasp the extent to which they may be technical limitations or otherwise in the LLM that they're implementing. I think one of the examples there, which goes to transparency, is open source, for example. You get a lot of discussion around open source models and that allaying some of the concerns in relation to transparency. I think there is a prime example of making sure everyone understands what that means. Is not just the model open source, is the entire AI system, which often isn't necessarily the case. It's not usually the proprietary software and the training data that's open source. It's the model, and understanding that is going to be important to transparency. So I think those two are really interesting, and there'll be lots more to come in years for those. But I think moving to the kind of regulatory aspects and the evolving regulatory framework, I'm sure again everyone on this call will have heard about the EU AI Act, which is causing a lot of press at the moment. I'll mention that briefly at the end, but I think, as you've probably seen, the short version on that is coming. It's been agreed at EU Parliament, and there's been, let's say, disagreement between the different countries as to the approach. I'll say that much. I think the general sentiment of EU AI Act to one side, the general approach by Western countries to the regulation of AI, in particular in relation to healthcare and pharma, has been that kind of no approach. So guidance, iteration, figuring out and learning, as opposed to necessarily hard and fast rules as to what can and can't be done. I think one of the examples I'll briefly mention here is the European Medicines Agency, which I think actually followed the FDA in kind of starting to give some information and consultation as to what it's thinking. And there's a consultation opened by the EMA, which closes at the end of the month, actually, which is all quite literally about a reflection paper on AI in the medicinal product life cycle, so squarely relevant to the issues today. And they're starting to give some of their thinking on some of the issues I'll briefly mention now. So on drug discovery, which we've been mentioning, obviously, in this panel so far, they've said that they've acknowledged that it's generally going to be low risk in relation to the use of AI and ML in drug discovery processes, in that the risk of non-optimal performance effectively sits with the sponsor in those circumstances. But they've said there, and this is kind of the kind of sting in the tail, is if those results contribute to the body of evidence for regulatory review, then the risk increases. So again, it goes back to the transparency point, knowing about what's in there. Another one briefly I'll pull on perhaps is interacting with regulators. Again, this goes to the kind of iteration discussion kind of approach to things, which is one of the points they've made in their reflection paper effectively is come to us early and talk to us, is what they've said, which again follows the themes I've mentioned, which is, and they've said specifically there, if your use of ML technologies is likely to be high risk, then engage with them for scientific advice early. I think that's something we'll see, the increased kind of collaboration between regulators as opposed to kind of hands-off rules in particular. As I mentioned the AI Act, I wouldn't mention much of it in this, but I think it'd be remiss of me not to mention it as the UK or EU representative on the call. I think to close on that, I think I'd say for those that are maybe not aware of how the EU AI Act is going forward, but I'm sure most of the call probably are. It is quite a comprehensive set of rules on regulation and use of AI. One of the big ones that's quite relevant for this group, and something to watch, frankly, for the next year, is the four-tiered approach and the general approach to general purpose AI and how that's going to be regulated. The way that's in 2 seconds, the way that's being approached is effectively saying, if you are releasing general purpose AI across the EU, then it may be regarded as something with a systemic risk, which comes with higher transparency requirements. So similar to the points I mentioned earlier, transparency and internal evaluation are going to be quite key. And I think akin to anyone who's dealt with GDPR or heard those dreaded letters for the past few years, self-assessment is effectively the way they're going. So it's a self-assessment by that particular company, coupled with quite harsh rules if you get it wrong. So yeah, as I said, watch this space for the next few years. Yeah.
Thank you, Jason. I'd like to open it up to the panel. I think one thing I'd like to say is this is a relatively new technology in terms of how quickly it's moving ahead, starting with ChatGPT 3 and then moving ahead now to the other models that are out there. I think that one of the questions I'd like to ask the panel is, with any new technology, whether it's electricity or IT innovations in the 90s, there's been a period of throwing a lot of investment resources and time into it and then seeing productivity gains come a little bit later. Where do you think we are in that journey with LLMs? And then, to that following question that Ram raised and Jason raised, as we start moving from general principles of transparency, reproducibility, explainability, down to actual performance where we're asking for in a model, how can we continue to engage with regulators in the US and the EMA and other places about how to get that right balance between innovation and safety? And I think maybe I'll just to open the conversation, has the discussion around AGI thrown us off kilter a little bit in terms of thinking hard and fast about how to actually institute these technologies into our own operations?
Yeah, if I could start, I mean, I think we always expect this first element of a technology hype curve, right? Where everybody gets really excited about it. There are a couple of things that are different here. One, just in the sense of how quickly we've seen early adoption of ChatGPT and some of the other capabilities, and integration into areas that are somewhat useful. I think many of us are using them in just regular writing circumstances, research and the like. I often use it to summarize papers for me, and it significantly increased my efficiency in that regard. But I think Ram had said in an earlier discussion that a lot of it is still sort of novelty. It's not where it's translating into practice, but that's kind of what we expect with technology in general, right? Electricity didn't come straight out of Thomas Edison's lab and then make it straight into industry. It took like 20, 30 years before factories started to become all electrified.
Shifting from hydropower to electric power, right?
Sure. And to some degree you would expect it here also, but I would say it's happening a lot faster. So I think that transition we're going to start to see in 2024. So and I'm not just saying that because our flagship product AutoIND is going to commercial release in the first quarter of next year. I think there's going to be an entire wave of new products that we're going to see where people have now had time to really work on the engineering and say, how do we get this into the workflow? How do we make sure that it's not doing things that it's not supposed to do? How do we train the models in such a way that they're able to really address a given workspace? In the case of the IND, it's making sure that we're able to reference the source documents of the sponsor, that wants to move this new drug forward. And make sure that we're not, introducing other information, making up dosing information or the like. And that's not a simple thing to do, but being able to sort of fine tune the AI, but put it into a package that's really useful. And I think people underestimate what it takes to do that and understand the workflow and how you make something like that useful. That was work that has had to happen, but a lot of people have been working on it now, like us, in different applications. And we're going to start to see the fruits of that very soon. And so, like, yes, there is a cycle. We haven't seen it translate quite yet, but we are about to.
Lena, I saw your head nodding there. Does this also go to, we have a lot of models out there, as Ari said. Some of them are proprietary, some of them are open source, but they all allow you to customize these tools for your own needs and using your own proprietary data sets. How do you look at that landscape there and advise people about how to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, like Ari, we think there's a lot going to be happening in 2024, and we're already seeing use cases internally that are just transformative, both with open source models, with commercial external models, and with our own fine tuning and our own model building. There's just depending on the application, et cetera, right? And so it really goes to just the power of being really crisp on the use case and harking back to some of the comments earlier, kind of what you need in performance in various key dimensions, right? And being really precise on that. And that maybe ties to the second prompt you had on performance and engaging regulators and the community, right? I think we are in the early days of, if you go back half a decade, people were talking about train test splits, et cetera. We're much more sophisticated as an industry about how we evaluate performance of models. And that's going to grow a lot, I think, with the emergence of these LLMs. What does good look like in the world of drug discovery? Very different from a general ChatGPT world, right? What are the key dimensions where we want to have deep understanding within companies, across companies, with the FDA about what good looks like, and then we're speaking around the same things. And Recursion has an effort together with Valence Lab, so that's a research institute we sponsor, on working with others to create common benchmarks so that we can evaluate models and have a common language of what it is that we expect our LLMs to do in various settings. So I think that's maybe an answer that ties your two prompts together around where we at in the cycle. We're super optimistic. There's a lot happening, and I think the way to really push that wave in a thoughtful way is through this industry engagement on benchmarks and I think what Jason called kind of technical standards.
that almost we have to start thinking about the underwriter's lab type of approach for AI and ML, where we're talking about the performance of a product within certain parameters, and also the really interesting challenge of when you're training, and question for the panel, when you're training on these data sets, you're using them both to organize information for a BLA or an NDA, but potentially also to make early drug discovery predictions about what compound to use. But also, does it force a regulatory decision or question downstream that might be about using a particular biomarker or a particular clinical trial design, and then getting the agencies comfortable with the way that decision or that suggestion has been made, and engaging with regulators around that? Does that resonate with you, Anand, as you're obviously looking at very, very large data sets at Roche and Genentech, and then trying to think about, how, I think, as you said earlier, how they impact those downstream decisions that aren't just pre-IND?
Yes, that is. It is critical when we are looking at large data sets. Sometimes we do come across things that we have never knew existed in the data. So how do you really actually take that kind of a find or an insight and tell the investigators or tell the regulators that, hey, something that we found which is going to be novel and came through our AI experiment that we did, or Gen AI or LLM experiment that we did, how do we get that buy-in? How do we see, how do we make this happen? It's a big question for us. In areas where it quite does not impact patient safety or anything have direct, it's much more amenable to such kind of work. However, when it comes to late stage development and applying data sets and trying to figure out how to justify certain things, it's going to be quite a bit of time. I mean, we are definitely we have not reached the peak of, let us say, inflated expectations in the hype cycle yet on the technology. But what we are noticing is this hype cycle is far more straight, and we are getting to it much more faster than any other technology at this point, because the utilization is so much and people are experimenting quite a bit as well. So given that, my feeling is that there is a potential, as long as Jason was saying that there is transparency on how we reach at a certain decision is absolutely critical here.
I think it's probably much more sensitive when you get into human trials and clinical trials. Obviously, you're working, obviously the decisions that you're making right then are affecting how you design those trials, and that affects the patients in the trials. But you're also much closer to the NDA or BLA, and so that there's much more to justify to some degree. And I wonder, Lena, whether you agree with this. I think at the earlier discovery stages, it's safer because you're still going to have to back that up with a physical experiment. So you're not saying that we are making a decision on moving something forward exclusively on an AI discovery. You're using that to help you make decisions about what to do the physical experiments on and move forward. And so then you still have that extra step that gives you that confidence for the regulatory submission.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And this is about that point of making sure that you're very crisp about the use case and what good looks like in these various optimizations. Maybe to add to answer to your question, Paul, in addition to the work we all have to do to share our know-how and educate the FDA, to Jason's early point, actually, I think Anand and Ari already made versions of this. There is this moment in time now where there's just so much coming out from both European regulators and American ones. And I know at Recursion, I'm sure at all these other places as well, we're deeply following and discussing those thought leadership pieces, the pilots, the guidance coming out. There's all kinds of opportunities to engage with that material. I mean, I think if you're listening to this, you should definitely be doing that, right? This is a special moment in time because we're in this inflection moment of LLMs and new generation machine learning models, to engage kind of in the other direction as well with what's coming out from regulators,
And, I think that FDA said, I mean, this is a general comment on engaging with the FDA and other regulators, come to them as early and often as possible when you have a potential data issue or approach that could change or impact a downstream regulatory decision. Talk to them really early about it. I think the most successful people who've managed to take a leading role in a technology space have gone to the FDA to share their thinking and help them understand the technology. Because oftentimes, as we know, we're all competing for the same talent. The technology industry is competing for that talent. Biotech is competing, and then government, of course, is trying to compete, but often struggling behind us because they simply can't move as quickly as we can, and they simply don't have the budgets to do so. But Jason, where do you see this shaking out, to pull back in the regulatory question of EMA, FDA, China, Japan? How should companies think about or optimize their engagement? Obviously, for a lot of trials, a lot of submissions, ideally are going to be global, and you don't want to have to have bespoke applications or discussions. You want to try and have that harmonization.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think the best you can do is frankly a really basic thing, which is having those conversations both with your tech provider and with the regulators where appropriate and when in a kind of in the right way. Because effectively, if you think about any including the companies on this call, they're also global as well. So they're also dealing with and grappling with similar issues for other people, as well as your competitors as well. So I think discussions are important because everyone is dealing with this very changing, shifting sands. Everyone's standing on sand, and it's all moving. But in particular, making sure that, going back to the transparency point, discussion over what is possible, what can be done, is the best way to approach your kind of devising a global strategy for rollouts, because there are going to be iterations. Everything is moving at the moment. I think, as you mentioned earlier, Europe, the UK, and the US are probably on one side of the spectrum. Obviously, Asia, very different. China in August this year released its version of regulation on generative AI, in particular focused on ChatGPT. But obviously the EU AI Act, that's going to be a particular specific issue to grapple with the next few years in the EU. But I think even beyond that, looking at global rollouts, even with an EU instrument like the EU AI Act, there's going to be quite a bit of variation in enforcement in different countries. And that's going to affect how you approach things as well. So I think, self-interested, but speak to your legal advisors because it's going to be interesting, particularly for the next few years. But I think, that's the best you can do. Really, is really having those open, frank conversations as quickly as possible, both with the tech providers who obviously are absolutely experts on this, and devising a global strategy with legal as well. I think one final point I'll just pick up on from earlier on AI discovery as well. I mean, it goes to the heart of both regulation and kind of IP and proprietary rights. That is also an area which is changing and shifting in different countries as well. You know, the extent to which intellectual property rights can arise in AI-related discoveries is a big question that I'm sure everyone's seen, and different countries again are taking slightly different approaches on that. But I think the overall theme is change. So there's room to on the policy side, lobby and seek or influence legislative change, but also an opportunity to really just have frank conversations. I think the practical point which we're seeing, we work for quite a few different players in different places on the kind of ecosystem, is using contract as much as possible, because the fundamental law is uncertain. So using contractual terms as much as possible to introduce that certainty is quite important.
I'd just add that, this is one place where the hype cycle actually kind of helps us, because the regulatory agencies themselves are being pretty technology forward. You heard that from Ram, the shift from NO to KNOW. EMA has, their effort, where they've reached out now and they've been thinking proactively about it. And, in our case, we had PMDA in Japan reach out to us proactively and say, like, we want to explore this. And the technology facilitates it as well, because LLMs are pretty agnostic in terms of the language. We've been playing around with AutoIND in German, Turkish, and Hebrew, but, we'll try it out in Japanese as well. It's a pretty flexible technology, and it facilitates that. It also, I would say, facilitates some of the early conversations that Jason was referring to. So in our case, some of the early pilot partners that we've been working with have said, what would be really good is if we could use this to put together a pre-IND briefing so that we can show this to FDA, get some feedback first. And that was pretty straightforward for us to do. It's the same technology. So, the technology in some ways facilitates, the steps that we have to do for the adoption.
That is great. So I think one thing we also heard from Jason was, even if you're a vendor, consider engaging with the regulators to explain your technology. I think really to wrap up here, I think we've got just about 5 or 6 minutes left. Can I ask one question to the panel? What advice would you have for each other? I think Lena, spoke about the need to really go back to, or have a bench to stack loop to ensure that the information you're generating from your models is validated by the biology, by experimentation. But what advice would you have for each other as you think about the implementation of LLMs in healthcare, especially as these models are going to be interlocking? Hospitals and health systems are using them to organize information, do diagnostic and care optimization. But of course, that can also feed into the use of real-world data for safety, follow-on indications. What advice do you have for each other about how to optimize this technology, and advice for the healthcare community in general about optimizing its use and ensuring we're all doing it safely and responsibly? I'll open it up to the panel.
There's just
Anand, what do you think?
one global statement, which is to say that the gap between experiment and real world deployment is much bigger than most people think. So it's really easy to do an experiment where you can do something really fancy with an LLM and post it on Twitter. And the gap between that and actually creating a deployable tool that functions reliably, consistently in a domain like biomedicine, where you need it to function consistently and reliably, is much greater than people think, and requires a lot of thought and engineering and experimentation, benchmarking. And so you've got to build that into whatever plans you have.
Start with low risk pilots. Low risk pilots.
For sure.
That's
any other thoughts? Please go ahead.
That's what precisely I was about to say. Low risk pilot. There is, when it comes to real human beings, there is a whole lot of scrutiny that we need to do in areas where it does not directly impact analysis, insight generation, stuff like that is definitely a great applications to experiment with. Sharing of information across the industry is something that is very critical and has to happen quite a bit, because there are certain innovative things that can happen pylon technologies on top of it, such as vector searches and stuff like that, is also critical. So this advancement in technology and sharing across that is very critical for us to understand how well we utilize these technologies to real world application.
I don't think
Lena,
it will be.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think this will be controversial with this group, but I think everyone here in this call, people listening who are kind of at this cutting edge of beginning to use LLMs in a regulatory environment, in drug discovery, I think we have an accountability to the field, accountability to each other, and for our companies individually to publish on this, to put out on our own thought leadership pieces. We can kind of shape what is expected and understood in this moment. So I think to this conversation about the hype cycle and where LLMs go, I think some of that is about how we show up and how we educate the field. And that's extra work sometimes on top of the difficulty of launching any product to begin with. But I think that is really going to reap big benefits if that is something we put collective effort into.
Yeah, I'd follow from that. I think that the extra work is also the kind of point for the legal side. You know, the majority of litigation arises out of uncertainty. So clarity is the biggest point. I think from there, you know, clarity as technology, clarity as to then the regulatory requirements, and then through to the legals on both sides is important. I think that's the kind of, you know, from the legal side, important from both the vendor and the kind of underlying company side is what are we thinking of doing now and what we're anticipating to do in the future, and as much as possible, which kind of takes the fun out of it sometimes, but as much as possible getting clarity on those issues. But I think that's pretty fundamental.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fundamental, especially when you think about in fast-moving technology spaces. We saw, I think back in 1999, a death in an early gene therapy trial really set the entire field back probably by 10 years. So we have to be cognizant about how, as Anand said earlier, how these actually impact public health and patient health, because a few bad instances or bad decisions can really cascade throughout the system and inhibit innovations that actually are really strong net positive gains for the healthcare system as a whole. I think we've also heard throughout this that it's really important to engage with policymakers and with, of course, regulators, the FDA, the EMA, the PDMA, and others early on. And there's an important role for trade organizations and representatives to play in that role. So maybe I'll hand over the last word to Elaine Ham to wrap it up with what the AIH is doing in this space, and then we'll adjourn and give a couple minutes back to our terrific panel. Thank you.
Thanks, fantastic. Elaine? Yep, I'm here. My video isn't on yet. There we go. Okay, maybe not. Well, we'll try. All right, thanks. Thanks everyone for your time. And yes, the AIH is very keenly aware of the need to have these conversations with regulatory agencies. The FDA, we recently put in our bid to join the consortium with NIST, and it's very keen on our minds of being able to get involved. And that's where a lot of our members come into play as well. And so that's one of really the big benefits of working with the AIH as a member, is joining us as we try to tackle these really challenging problems. And of course, I want to thank all of our panelists and our amazing moderator, Paul Howard from Amicus. We really appreciate your insights as well as your time. And I want to thank you as the audience for joining us. And I'm so sorry we ran out of time. There was a number of questions. We can't get to them all, but I think that the interest in the number of questions really points to the need for more opportunities to collaborate and have these continued conversations, which is the main goal of the AAIH and our membership. So I would add,
and we will do our best to share those questions with the panelists and with Ram, and hopefully publish them either on the website or social media so that everyone can have an opportunity to get their questions answered.
Fantastic, Paul. Thank you. And yes, this will be available on our website, theaaih.org. And this is the second of many webinars we're going to be doing on the subject of AI and healthcare. So if you are, watch out for additional webinars. But if you're interested in being a panelist, or if you have your own topics that you're interested in having webinars on, please consider membership so you can join us, and so that we can continue these really important conversations with the ultimate goal of bringing AI to healthcare and helping deliver healthcare to patients together. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks to a terrific panel. Thank you for your time. Take care, everyone.